The United States says South Africa's submission to the International Court of Justice has no merit. This after Pretoria applied to force Israel to stop its attacks on Gaza, possibly impacting Washington, which is helping Tel Aviv with its offensive on the enclave. Over 22,000 Palestinians have died in the conflict. It follows a surprise attack on southern Israel by Hamas fighters in early October, which claimed nearly 1,200 lives. International relations expert Professor Gilbert Khadiagala joins us for more. Prof, appreciate your time this evening. What specific legal grounds does South Africa cite in its genocide submission against Israel?
The broad legal ground is the Genocide Convention of 1948 that was enacted to prevent further atrocities along the lines of the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews. So South Africa has put a number of issues on to the International Court of Justice that the attacks, the war in Gaza itself is an act of genocide against the Palestinians. And they list very specific instances of mass killings of a group. And that's what the Genocide Act defines. The massive killing of a group, partly on race, ethnicity, and religion, and so on. So the broad category is that the genocide being committed in the Gaza Strip against the Palestinians is grounds enough under that Genocide Convention. But they also list other instances of attacks on socio-economic infrastructure, the starvation of large numbers of people, the destruction of health infrastructures and so on as grounds for genocide, amounting to genocide. So there are quite a number of issues that are covered under the Genocide Convention of 1948 that South Africa has put before the court.
Well, Prof, you talk about multiple issues, but how strong is the legal argument presented by South Africa in its application to the ICJ?
You see, that will have to be determined in the hearings that are going to come up next week, because the court has to decide whether, in fact, that claim by South Africa is valid or not. And Israel takes it very seriously, because even though while they have condemned it, they have expressed willingness to go and defend themselves at the ICJ. So the issue about whether the claims are correct or not is an issue that the court will have to decide. But at least South Africa has raised some critical issues that are within that convention that it claims are being committed, the genocide, acts of genocide are being committed in Gaza against the Palestinians.
Now, the Israelis have spoken out against it, as have the Americans, saying that there is no basis. What do we read into the fact that there is some reaction coming from the United States and Israel?
I think on the U.S. side, there was really no expectation from the South African part that the U.S. would support the ICJ allegation or the pressure on Israel, because the U.S. has consistently supported Israel in the war against the Hamas. And I think the statement that was issued today said very explicitly that Israel is defending itself, and that's why the United States is supporting it. So it's very understandable that the U.S. would take that position. On the Israeli part, again, they have condemned those accusations, but as I said, they have said they are going to defend them, because this goes at the heart of Israeli national identity, the issues around genocide and so on. So they are very embarrassed, I think, by these accusations. But that's why they also want to go and defend themselves. So it is going to be an important legal drama at the ICJ, really, to hear what both sides are saying about that case.
Now, how does the ICJ typically handle cases involving allegations of genocide? Is there any precedents that we can look at that might dictate or determine how they're likely to react?
You see, there are two things they'll do. One is that the case may drag on for years, and there is a good case of the Gambia taking Myanmar to the ICJ in 2019, but the case is still ongoing up to now. Gambia was accusing Myanmar of genocide against the Rohingyas here. But the other thing that could happen is that the ICJ would issue an interim interdict on the Israelis. That means they would urge them not to continue their violations, the genocide allegations against the Hamas and the Palestinians. But it's very difficult to enforce that decision because the ICJ doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. So even if the court rules in the interim that Israel has to stop the genocide in Gaza, there is no way that that decision is going to be implemented. But meanwhile, the case will still go on in The Hague. Because the interim measure is very different from the final verdict that the court is going to issue. And that could be maybe 4 or 5 years from today. Nobody knows.
Well, it's pretty clear from what's transpired and what's been said by both parties when you speak about Tel Aviv and you speak about Pretoria, that neither party are very fond of each other. But there's also the United States that's kind of brought into the equation. There've been issues around the ship that should have offloaded or loaded ammunition that came via that came through Russia, from what we understand. So there's that issue. So is South Africa dithering on a political, diplomatic, if you will, impasse with countries like the United States?
I think you are correct. The Cold War between the U.S. and South Africa began in earnest last year with the accusations by the U.S. that South Africa was leaning more towards Russia, allowing Russian ships to come here, and then, of course, the debates about the BRICS. So there has been some disenchantment on the part of the United States about South Africa's actions. And then when you look at South Africa's vote on Ukraine, again, the United States was not very happy. And then in October last year with the Hamas attacks and then the Israeli retaliation, that has just ratcheted up the kind of pressure between the U.S. and South Africa. And I don't know whether that is going to end anytime soon, but this legal battle in The Hague is going to simply to be a continuation of what I'm calling here the Cold War between the U.S. and Pretoria, but focus mainly, I think, on South Africa's intention to embarrass the Israelis, to put more pressure on the Israelis so that they can, in fact, step back and withdraw from Gaza or maybe end that war. I think the purpose of South Africa is a moral one, to continue the diplomatic war that started even before last year, because South Africa looks at itself as the most consistent supporter of Palestine. And so I don't see this as a very unique moment, but it's simply going to add more pressure, therefore, on the South Africa-U.S. part of that relationship, because the U.S. is not very happy.
Now, should we be surprised that South Africa is at the forefront of this application to ICJ and that it's not a country from the West that is mightier than Pretoria, if you will?
You know, the ICJ, the Genocide Convention is very flexible. Any country that feels that genocide is being committed somewhere by a member state of the United Nations, they can go to the ICJ and demand that that country should stop. So this is an opportune moment for South Africa, actually, to bring that case to the ICJ. In fact, what they are doing is essentially pushing what we could call the envelope of international legality, because that's why the ICJ is there, and that's why the Genocide Convention is on the books. So I don't think we should expect any other country. You can see now countries like Malaysia coming on board and saying we are going to support South Africa's case. because realistically, you could not expect Western countries to bring that case against Israel, who is actually their main ally. So I think South Africa is being, nicely opportunistic here, but also, it's pushing its agenda of support for Palestine. And this has to demonstrate that it's important that that war should end. And South Africa has been very consistent on that issue about the end of the war, the end of the atrocities. So I see this as an opportunity, therefore, as I said, to push the international legal envelope on the Genocide Act. And whether it succeeds or not, I think South Africa has made a point, a legal point, and we'll see how the court reacts.
Well, something that has to be considered, and I'm wondering if it is in that submission, and that is the issue around the humanitarian aspects to the crisis in Gaza. Is this a part of that submission?
Yeah, no, I think the humanitarian issues are wrapped around the atrocities that are being committed. Because part of the submission says you cannot starve a whole people of food and water and all that. And this is what is essentially producing the refugees. You are preventing the refugees even from leaving their homelands. And there have been statements made by Israeli officials, actually, that are saying, we don't want the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And South Africa is pointing to some of those statements to bolster the point that, in fact, Israel wants the mass destruction of the Palestinians as a people. Really, that is where that argument hinges on. If you're talking about expelling the Palestinians from Gaza, what do you mean? You're talking literally about getting rid of them, decimating them as a people. So those are part of what is captured in the Genocide Convention. And it breeds the kind of massive humanitarian crisis that we see. And I think South Africa is making that point.
Well, Professor, we've talked to a very large extent about South Africa's submissions, but we haven't talked really about the Israeli defense. What do you think that defense is going to be constituted of? What will they have to say for themselves?
Their defense is basically self-defense. That we attacked the region, we attacked Gaza after the attack of October 7th, where our people were attacked. And therefore, they will be arguing that this is a very frivolous case because the nation states have the rights and the privileges to defend themselves when attacked by enemies such as Hamas. So it's a very simple legal argument they are going to put across. And then with other issues like humanitarian crisis, they will be arguing that these are really just outcomes of a larger self-defense argument that they are putting across.
Now, one of the things that...
So I don't see... go ahead.
No, I'd like you to carry on, please.
No, I don't see anything innovative in the argument of self-defense, because I think that's the only argument that they have been making consistently since October 7th, that we went into the Gaza Strip to preempt, the decimation of the Israeli state. And I think that's the bigger argument they are making.
So when we take a look at the ICJ, and if we were to put on their glasses as they look at this submission, will they consider the fact that 1,200 Israelis were killed, and that now 22,000 Palestinians have been killed, and that this has been going on for, I think, close on 3 months. In fact, that's 3 months in a few days. So at what point do you bombard those that have attacked you, and then sort of slow down on that bombardment because there is no retaliation or limited retaliation, or that innocent civilians, multiple innocent civilians, are being killed?
I think that's the argument for the equivalence, which I think the judges are more favorable to it, because you can't claim that you have 1,200 who are killed, and then you are retaliating by killing 22,000. So the numbers don't really add up. And then also you can't, not just the 22,000, but the other additional harm you've done to the people of Gaza. I think that's, so my reading of it immediately is that the judges are going to be more sympathetic to this case. I think they are going to argue that, in fact, Israel, in the interim, they were going to argue that Israel should withdraw from Gaza, they should stop the violence and so on. The point I made from the beginning was whether, in fact, that is going to have any effect on Israeli behavior, because I suspect that they'll simply rubbish that decision, even if the ICJ comes up with what we'll call a liberal position on that case that is favorable to South Africa and Palestine. I don't see it being implemented at the end of the day. And so we have to wait and see whether something is going to move on the Israeli side or on the American side, because they are now trying to put more pressure on Israel. Although the argument is we are talking about the release of refugees and then probably after, the release of the prisoners that Hamas captured, and after that debate is resolved, maybe then we can talk about a ceasefire and so on. But even if the ICJ comes up with a position that is favorable to Palestine, as South Africa is going to demand, it's very difficult to enforce that decision. And that is
Professor,
the reality.
we're going to have to call it time on this conversation. Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, international relations expert, speaking to us about South Africa's submission to the ICJ.